overvalued their losses. Inviting all the prime minister.
You're here. 3, 2, 1. UPD!
Is there like a steps to?
Wait, sorry, does anyone have an extra timer?
You can mark.
Is there like a steps to? Like, I'm like
Step.
no.
So maybe you can press the mic.
Maybe I can bring the table here if you wanna. Oh, is it okay? Yeah. Is it okay? Hello. Okay. In my debate career, I had never been in the top 10 of speakers. I have lost a final where everyone expected us to win. In high school, I have been in the octo finals. But yet, then and then again, I undervalued my losses and kept on trying because I always did not let the question of how it have happened if I did not try and allowed myself to experience what could have been. And I'm so happy to be here. A few points of setup. The first is that what do we mean when you undervalue your losses? It means is that you likely don't feel as bad. You're willing to be detached, or you're more willing to move on as a result because you're less held back. The second is also the creation of peer networks and institutions that help you to get over it, because it means that people also want you to undervalue your losses. They want you to try and they want you to have this hope. In the comparative, what it means is that individuals often lose hope because they overvalue their losses and therefore feel more deeply about it, but also they have to defend a world where people judge each other for those losses and often discourage them as a result. Opposition might say that this means that you encourage risky losses and behavior. Sorry, give me a sec, but my timer didn't start. What time is it?
Sorry.
1 minute and 5 seconds.
Sorry, what?
1 minute.
1 minute and 5 seconds.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Opposition might say this means that you encourage risky behavior, but there are many reasons for why this is not a debate-winning harm. Firstly, in many instances, you don't choose how you lose. It is often arbitrary. You can die, your family members can die, and often this is out of our control, and therefore it's essential to move on. This is what affects us most, and therefore this is the most important harm that you can have. The second is also, risky behavior happens not from losses, but an overvaluation of your wins, which is why they say, a gambler only stops right before they win, right? All of this means is that these are things that are out of the debate, and you have to prioritize where your losses matter most. The first argument, therefore, is that why is it important that uniquely important that you have a strange sense of optimism for you to do meaningful things? The second is that why is it the capacity to move back and bounce back maximize people's preferences the most? And thirdly, even if people do fail horribly, what is the way for how we're able to maximize that catharsis? Firstly, why is this optimism uniquely important for meaningful things? The structure of this is, firstly, I'll go to the individual and the societal. Firstly, in the comparative, you're going to paralyze individuals because it's a visceral feeling that repeats in your head and creates a sense of fear and you fail. And I would posit optimism is far harder. When you fail, you will always feel bad. You know this, and this is much more proximate to you. In the comparative, the lack of attachment, firstly, just makes it easier for you and gives your future the benefit of the doubt. But secondly, you feel like you have a chance because even if it's hard, you think you need to move on and people will want to support you to move on. But thirdly, it is also that people who try, even if they have lost, they're far more supported. And this is why you also have better role models and structures that will encourage you to move on and the ways in which that you are able to do so, which is why role models are better. This is particularly important for people that are already vulnerable and have already lost in their lives. But secondly, this is also good for everyone because everyone will face these setbacks regardless. Secondly, on the societal, I explained that it's the most vulnerable where you have already lost in life where these things are likely more proximate. In the comparative, you don't try and give up because the narratives and status quo will always benefit the majority in these states. It will always tell you that when you are poor, you have to remain poor. Religious structures will tell you that you are poor because God told you to do so. And oftentimes, the trajectory of your life will remain on your hands. In the comparative, when you undervalue your losses, one, this allows people to overcome multitudes of hurdles and allows them to come back. But secondly, this pushes people to triumph over overwhelming things. Things like being able to protest against the state, even if it means I will lose some comrades, even if it means that I might lose my job, is particularly important because in the comparative, this is what makes sustainable movements because a lot of meaningful things will make you lose and lose and time again. But the importance of undervaluing those losses is never losing sight of your goal, which is why you're far more likely to be able to meet it in the comparative where you give up much easily. What therefore is the way? On our side, we maximize your preferences because firstly, it allows you your future. Individual preferences are often far more explored when you have more years to be able to try it. But secondly, you also create communities that make it better for individuals too because they understand the feeling, they understand the struggle, and want to always share that with others. The last thing I want to explain is that why is this argument debate winning? The first is because this is a certain benefit. This debate is about how people feel. It's about how societies construct themselves to be able to fight, to help those that have lost. We explain why that's far better under our side. The second argument I want to make is that why is it the capacity to move on and bounce back uniquely important? And the way for this argument is that it is uncertain what life challenges will come your way. You do not know. You can lose multiple times in your life. But the difference is that people all have the capacity to learn from it. The difference that we solve is the initiative to want to try again and move on because it's often daunting. What if I fail in ABP? What if I never try in UADC and at least be happy with the potential I could have had? All of this limits the maximal potential that you might have and often disables you from being able to take care of yourself. The problem with opposition is firstly is that the most worst problems that you will get are things you can control. In the comparative, you will permanently internalize it. But also, the lack of silver lining means that you do not know what is good. And the comparative, therefore, is that on our side, we can likely appreciate the things that are good even when the things are hard. And this allows you a sort of catharsis that even when things are bad, there are things that are still going to come for you. And even if that's not true, it is good that people live a worthy and happy life even if their situations are destitute. Because there's no certain that we can change it. We actually have that more under our side, but these are things that absolutely help because the natural feeling of individuals is loss and disappointment. When you have that clarity of mind, you don't let losses define you. You have the ability to be far more objective of your situation and be able to handle it with grace and be able to handle it with the help of other people. That is particularly good. On our side, why do people learn better? Firstly, it is because they fail. They allow themselves to fail and try to pick it up where it is. But secondly, they also expect themselves to fail and think that is good, which is why they're likely to risk and diversify a lot more, even in personal relationships, even in connections, which is why that social support is far better. The comparative here again is that it is far more important when it's uncertain whether you'll have to lose multiple times, but the capacity to learn from it allows you to maximize those preferences because it's the most important change in this debate. But before that, I'll take OO. No POI. Last thing is I want to go against the worst case. Firstly, even if people do fail horribly, why is it the case that we're still better? The first is that I just assure you that there is honor in failing. If I had died at my octos, that is perfectly fine. The moment that I know that I could have maximized that potential allows me to say my dream to myself and think that it was good. The second is that I just want to wait. The regret of having done something will always wear you out over not being able to try it. And this is because under our side, when you do try it, you're always able to have that sort of closure that, okay, maybe I did ABP, maybe I lost, but it meant that there was something that was good and I tried it, and a lot of other times this is what keeps us going in life. But thirdly, I just want to know, your personal catharsis can only be solved by you. There are a lot of institutions that will help. Things like therapy, things like social movements, things like being able, for example, to fix all of these things. We think that your own self is what drives you. Sorry, thank you so much.
We thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Now to start off the op bench, let's invite our leader of opposition.
NUS! 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 I'm not quite sure where to speak from. Should I just... Would that be okay if I move to this one?
Yeah. Can I just a minute, okay? Yeah. It's out of the frame, so anybody who wants this one. Okay, so sorry.
Is the mic working? Okay, can everyone hear me? I'll just, the mic isn't really on, so I'll just speak. I want to observe that in the status quo, the world we live in today is a world where human beings do overvalue losses. Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for this when he wrote Think Fast and Slow, where individuals have a natural bias towards things they already have and things they value. It is therefore incumbent on government bench to defend a counterfactual world that is different from the status quo. One where individuals move past loss more quickly, whether it's loss of individuals in their lives, money, or individuals in their society. We will say in all of those instances, we don't want that world. Two arguments therefore from opening opposition. Firstly, why this overvaluing of losses leads to you reflecting and learning from mistakes far more on an individual and societal level. Secondly, why this increases risk-taking behavior and why that's bad. Firstly, on why this leads to more improvement. I want to observe that the natural human inclination among all of us is not to think about our mistakes enough, absent an overvaluing of losses. This is because of two reasons. Number one, thinking of mistakes is extremely psychologically difficult. You have to reconcile with an image of yourself which did something wrong. And the bigger the mistake, the more devastating. Whether it is, for example, not saying goodbye to your father who left you, or losing lots of money in an investment, or making a mistake in a debate. All of these things don't gel with our conception of ourselves as loving, caring, caring, intelligent, capable people. And therefore, the psychologically easiest thing for the vast majority of people to do in the vast majority of instances is to block these things out of their mind. Try and move on. Blame someone else. Blame the judge. Blame the emotion. Don't blame yourself. These are the tendencies that individuals have when you do not overvalue losses, when you do not force people to reconcile with their mistakes. They blame others or they try to pretend the mistake never happened. Therefore, this is a world where people learn less from their mistakes. In the comparative, had this narrative or this idea of this overvaluation of losses creates the necessary rumination. Yes, it hurts in the heart not to, for example, progress past an octo-final of UADC like I did last year. But it made me so much better because that pain pushed me to improve, to speak better, to learn more. This is the sort of pain that makes people stronger, better people. And across a society, it makes our thinkers smarter, it makes our politicians better, it makes our economists wiser. It is a significantly better thing for us to have. No, when we force people to confront their mistakes. Secondly, the people responsible for mistakes often want to avoid accountability. They want to blame nature or randomness, or they want to pretend mistakes didn't occur. These are your politicians, your CEOs. These are the individuals who want you to undervalue loss, who want you to move on. And these are the individuals that this narrative would benefit greatly. And this means, therefore, that these are a set of people who have a disproportionate amount of control over the media, over campaigns, who do downplay and belittle loss. But what happens in our comparative? Our narrative of overvaluing loss turns it obscene. It is obscene for a politician to say that that safety error in that factory was unpreventable, for example, because we as a society value loss so much, we hold them accountable regardless of their power. A society that overvalues loss overvalues the safety and security of its people, and it is a society that takes care of every one of their own, often against the desires of those in power. Therefore, overvaluing loss improves society. It forces us to reckon with mistakes in government, in that economists make, in investment, that destroy lives around the world. Weigh this mistake. At most, opening of government's impact is heart pain. Yes, heart pain, very sad. But having a better economy, having a safer society, having a world which improves and iterates upon its mistakes faster and better, it allows us to avoid losses altogether, the most important impact in this debate. And we would say that many of the harms of loss don't come from heart pain. They come from the inherent fact that your father died, that the people around you who used to love you are no longer around. We avoid that better on our side of the house. The government might tells you that overvaluing loss prevents you from being able to keep trying. I think, number one, that ABP was not a good example of loss. Yes, it makes a heart pain when we lose debates, but millions of people around the world make even worse risks. For example, investing large amounts of their money and then losing it all. For example, trying to take on a risky job or entering a risky job market and then not being able to find employment in oversaturated job markets like the one we see today. We will say that a world where people don't take on those losses are worlds where they avoid way worse and more painful harms than the one opening opposition talks about. But in a world where people do value things, in a world where capitalism pushes us to always try, because that is how it succeeds. It is a world where we glorify resilience independent of this narrative. It is a world where people in power want us to keep working and keep trying and keep striving. We would say that therefore, these are counterfactual narratives that push us to keep trying regardless of overvaluing losses. What overvaluing loss does is that it is the voice in the back of your head that counteracts all of these other narratives and forces you to do things properly, carefully, and avoid finding yourself unemployed, broke, or physically harmed. Therefore, it is an important counteracting force that forces us to improve, avoids us making bad decisions. I'll take closing if you have one, if not opening.
Is there no natural incentive to avoid pain and get a job?
Of course there is, but as I mentioned earlier, even if you are rationally inclined to do something like reflect, we as human beings don't always do what's the most rational thing for us. In fact, we very rarely do. We do think we have psychological biases that we need to check. For example, glossing over your mistakes. For example, blaming other things. Most debaters think they're an above average debater, and unfortunately, statistically, that's impossible. We need to overvalue loss to make people believe that they have made mistakes in order for them to then improve and become better. To be clear, I know I talk about debaters a lot, but think about your engineers and whether you want better buildings. Think about your economists and whether you want a better economy. Think about every other area of life where it is important for people to iterate and improve. Second issue in this debate, why this reduces risk-taking behavior. Opening government tells you that people take risks because they overvalue gains. Yes, they overvalue gains relative to possible losses. That's why they take risks. Why then is a less risky and more careful society better? Number one, losses usually accrue onto the most vulnerable the most often. For example, when investors make risky decisions and plunge economies into debt or into recession, the people laid off first are the poor, vulnerable migrant workers who need the job the most and have no job protections, versus those who are rich, who yes, they incur economic losses, but are not on the street. In times of economic boom, they are the ones who reap the benefit the most, and it does not trickle down, because they are often the ones in charge of the levers of power economically who own the most amount of shares. But also, risk engenders, therefore, this means then that for the most vulnerable, it is more important for us to protect them from those losses than to allow for the most powerful to reap those gains. That's why risk-taking behavior is bad. Number two, risk engenders unpredictability. When you have a society which is more risky and therefore has more gains and more losses, it is harder to plan around a society. It is harder to engage in long-term economic planning when you go through more boom and bust cycles. It is harder for you to be able to make your life plan when you take more risky decisions individually and have them derail. And risk is inherently unpredictable and even more unpredictable in their work. Our ability to foresee things, plan, allows us to grow economies, grow societies, and grow lives far better. So proud to oppose.
We thank the Leader of Opposition for what is a fine speech. Inviting on the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
3, 2, 1. Unify!
Sorry to be cheesy. It was my dream to be on a live stream. God damn it. Oh wait, sorry mom. Hi mom. Thanks for everyone who's watching. The Pinoys, you know who you are. I was told to say something for my speech, but I won't. One, because my mom is probably on the stream. But secondly, I have a sense of dignity. Oh, wait, I'm missing a paper. Okay. Check. Unfortunately for opening opposition, the alternative is not status quo. There are variations and mixes of both, which is why they cannot defend this. And obviously, Ian knifes this characterization when in less than 1 minute after admits that people in status quo don't want to value losses. So it can't obviously be status quo that they're defending. In fact, the true counterfaction of this debate is that people are wired to overvalue losses. That when you have a loss, you feel so bad about it that you don't think anything after can possibly be better. That is a false counterfactual. Do not let Redo lie to you in the next speech. I'll first talk about everything that they said about societal change and give an extension there already. Then I'll talk about everything that they do not respond to coming from Jade. Firstly, on systemic change. The first thing that they say is that you have more accountability. The main response to this is that there is no response to the prerequisite hope that Jade explains is important. Open government and Gov as a whole is not defending zero sense of loss. We are just defending an undervaluing of that loss. So you obviously feel bad that you lost something, but it means that you have the prerequisite hope to act on it, which are all of the reasons Jade explains that I won't explain because I was told I rebuilt too much, which means that on their side of the house, they have no response. Secondly, let's flip this. On their side of the house, politicians are far more populist who can say things like, who am I to say that any change is going to be better? Why would you want to change the government if I am the one who is giving everything now? It cannot possibly be worse than me, because if you lose me, then you lose something that's very important. The second thing they say is that there is a lot of risk. The main response to this is that this is obviously intuitively not true. If you look at anything in society, in any industry, things like moving fast and breaking things, it is only the ability to do things like innovate and the willingness to innovate that allows us to move fast and look past losses. So if you care about any advancement, whether it was the polio vaccine or the COVID vaccine, these are only things that existed as a result of people willing to look past their losses and not quit and bank all of their eggs in one basket and quit after the first failure. Here's the main extension. Greed is overarchingly caused by an overvaluation of loss. 3 reasons. 1, there's a fear of opportunity cost, that it could have gone to other things and therefore it is not valuable to me. Secondly, it hurts your ego to lose things because you compare yourself to people who have more, which is why crab mentality and other kinds of societal ills are worse on all. Shout out, Kyle. Thirdly, because of the groupthink that exists on their side of the house in society, where it's not just yourself overvaluing that loss, it's literally every other person. So why would you ever care about giving to other individuals if you feel that there is a very big pain in losing that loss? What changes on our side? 1, people are simply more willing to part with possessions. It might be true for both the rich and poor, but the marginal benefit is obviously most felt by the poor because inherently they have less to lose and therefore a lot less to give. There are a few impacts from this. 1, societal structures are far more redistributive because as a society we know and are less attached to individual loss and can help others, which means that you have more systems of charity, which means you have more people being able to dedicate resources to others. But secondly, individually people are far less conceited and selfish, which is why you're more willing to give. Where in a 50-50 where you could have donated that money or could have kept it for yourself, you give that far more often under our side. 2 points of weighing. 1, it is simply the far most concrete benefit in the round. It is the prerequisite for any happiness because we explain why these people who have less simply get more. But secondly, opening opposition has no proof for the counterfactual. We built a very comprehensive counterfactual in this part. Second part then, how do you change and move forward? They say that you learn less from mistakes. Again, it is not about whether you have access to the information necessary to fix those mistakes because on either side of the house, you will understand like if I didn't study, then I'm gonna fail the test. Happened to me a lot of times. It is on their side of the house where these things are far worse. 5 reasons. 1, the prerequisite for people to review their mistakes is only through the willingness to try again for the reasons of Jade. Secondly, even if you don't learn from these mistakes, this obviously runs into the last argument comes from Jade as to why people are simply happier. But on that, 3 more responses. 1, on the clarity of mind. Opposition is not rumination, it is obsession. You feel as if nothing is better than what could come after, which is why there's no reason to believe that people would have the energy to believe anything is good enough after to try again. Versus under our side of the house, where even if people might feel less about the things that they lose, that obviously translate to the composite benefit that people are far more willing to accept things in the future and try towards them in the future. But secondly, even if you could change, you never feel as good about it. It is always compared to what happens previously. So even if you change things on their side of the house, individually people suffer. You always discount your next benefit, your next job, your next thing in life. You always compare it and feel bad about it. But lastly, if there is change in opposition, that is a bad kind of change in opposition. Why? Because you are more resentful of the next thing, which is why you are far more resentful. It creates more toxic environments where even if you get a new job, a new girlfriend, a new wife, these are things that get far worse because you understand that these people don't care about you. On that, we explain that this is just so difficult to seek a better future on opposition for the reasons Jade explains. The weighing of this is clearly, on our side of the house, we secure each individual's future on scale because the number of choices that you get is infinitely larger because you don't self-select out of those choices. But secondly, the magnitude, you feel extremely better because you don't limit yourself arbitrarily to all of these things. Lastly, happiness in spite of it all. The most painful losses, aside from the things that Jay talks about in the last argument, are ones that are out of our control. Things like a death in the family, things like systemic poverty. The problem is as to why it gets worse on their side, one, is that people are personally internalized, it is permanently internalized to yourself. Because versus on our side, people attribute less importance, which is why people can disconnect, detach, and actually feel better about themselves, versus on their side where people will always feel guilty about being poor, always feel guilty about people dying, even if it realistically wasn't their fault. But secondly, and this is important, you are less able to look past hardships and find silver linings. Before that, go.
So presumably in this world, there would still be narratives like the American dream, people in power trying to force you to work harder. All of these things keep you trying regardless, right?
They might exist, but it's not in a vacuum. If you discount everything, even if there might be external narratives, there's no reason to believe that it's solvent on their side. Whereas all the reasons I just gave explain why you're more willing to accept those narratives and try more in the future. What do we get from this? I said that you're more able to find silver linings. If I promise, I wouldn't be able to be here without my friend Elle, who taught me that losses are not that bad, who taught me that these things might not be so bad and you can find the beauty in everything. What is the weighing of this? One, people most vulnerable who are affected by loss, regardless, we allow them a means for escape, which means that on either side of the house, where there might be people, and again, this is all of their benefits are speculative, right? Where there might be people who are continuously affected by loss, regardless, on our side of the house, we allow them to at least look past all of the hardships and look at the other parts of their life that might be meaningful. But secondly, you reduce aggressions towards other people who are vulnerable. In a world where people think that losing over and over is such a bad thing, that's where you get more discriminatory because it gets attached it gets detached from the action and attached to the person, which is why on their side of the house, these people feel far worse, oppress others far worse, and otherwise don't have any counterfactual. At the end of the speech, I promise I've done so much. We have too much material. We have to advance. We'll see you in the goddamn final.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech. Now to wrap up the top half, let's invite on the Deputy of Opposition.
Over the course of our lives, we will experience much loss. It is because life is oftentimes arbitrary. Where you're born, who you're born as, the people you meet along the way, and how they choose to interact with you. In a world where we don't have control and we are always likely to lose, the one and only thing we can do is to overvalue our losses, because that is the only world in which we retrospect, we reflect, and we think about ways in which it could be better. The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is to go against responses to our other opening. They have two claims. The first big claim they make is that this is the crux of what gives you science and innovation. I have three responses. The first thing I'd like to know is that scientific or technological innovation is not determined by these types of conceptions of loss, but oftentimes things like market demand. So for instance, if you think more people are going to buy the product as opposed to less, that is oftentimes a desire to want to do it. The second is a result of profit motives. If there are very big gains, you will therefore necessarily look at that. It's not necessarily about the losses. The third is that scientific innovation and advancement actually comes from people's desire to minimize loss. We want to do things like minimize the loss of life. We want to do things like minimize poverty. We want to do things like minimize hunger because we think those are all things that are valuable to therefore necessarily solve. The second claim they then have have in deputies to say, but we need this for people to give money and that impacts the poor, and they claim this is incredibly important outcome because poor people are incredibly vulnerable. 3 responses. The first is that taxation systems exist regardless because government needs to redistribute that to necessarily have welfare because the middle class and lower class make up a significant proportion of the voting demographic. The second is that the largest donors, oftentimes companies and NGOs or wealthy people, do it because they want tax breaks, prestige or legacy. All of these are things that are unlikely to go away. And the last is that religions often compel you to donate regardless of this motion. Alms giving is a practice that brings you salvation. Those are all reasons why this debate isn't one about welfare. Now, I know the clash in this debate lies in what responses people have to the respective conceptualizations of loss, and that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my speech explaining. But the first thing I want to note is Ian's POI response, because if you check your notes, opening government doesn't have a case. They have a scenario of a world where we undervalue it and therefore come back, bounce back stronger. But that's not the true consideration, right? There are a variety of ways in which people necessarily behave, and I'm going to weigh up to explain why our conception of the world is more likely. But there are a variety of other reasons as to why people won't just sink into loss per se. The first is that society as a whole glorifies individuals who are resilient, especially in a world where we overvalue loss, because overcoming that loss is therefore something to be seen as incredibly morally credible. The second is that society oftentimes wants people to do better. The government has incentives for people to want to try better. Communities want their members to succeed. These are all reasons why people will tell you to try again, and I'm going to help you to try again. I'll explain later why that doesn't necessarily happen on the comparative. The first question in this debate is therefore, what exactly does undervaluing mean? Does it mean that we take losses in stride, as OG says, and try harder? Or does it mean we undervalue it in bad ways? There are 3 reasons why we undervalue it in bad ways, inherent to undervaluation, which is going to cut out their ability to have positive benefits. The first thing is that most people are not introspective because it is difficult to reflect as per what Ian tells you. Oftentimes, we don't want to think we're bad people, and therefore the way we undervalue is to pin the blame on other individuals. The second thing which OG concedes is that to undervalue means to have catharsis, and to have catharsis, it means you don't want to feel it's like your fault. Therefore, you're likely to blame other circumstances. Say it comes down to luck, as opposed to reflecting on it or therefore necessarily doing better. The third inherent reason is that undervaluing means you think of this loss as frivolous. You don't think it's important to you. You don't think it's likely to happen again. You don't think you have to bother about it in the future. And these are all reasons why you don't therefore necessarily reflect and deal with it in other ways. The second question, what does overvaluing loss mean? Because I accept that it could mean taking this in your stride and therefore doing better and working on it and really reflecting, or it could mean falling into a pit of misery where you lose all your self-confidence. The reason why we uniquely on our side are people going to improve in more positive ways, because when people overvalue their losses, the only way in which other people can make them feel better is to help them in more productive ways. Because when people reflect and blame themselves, our response is to go, just let us not let that happen again, right? As opposed to just brushing it off or being dismissive, because being dismissive is not the way you get someone who overvalues loss to necessarily listen to you. That's the unique deadlock breaker as to why the benefits manifest more on our side of the house. Now I'm going to go into Ian's 2 extensions. The first is where he explains that you improve society. This is an incredibly important impact. Now I know the call out they have here is something about what we're defending with regards to status quo. Ian explains to you why a lot of people overvalue loss. I think we prefer a world where even more people did this, because our impacts will be magnified in that regard. Ian explains to you about politicians and people in authority who have an incentive to necessarily undervalue these things. I'm now going to preempt a further argument that might arise. A potential argument might be to say overvaluing loss makes people more susceptible to emotions and fear-mongering, things like populism, quick fix solutions. The reason why this doesn't necessarily exist on our side of the house is because existential threats have symmetric emotional impact on people by virtue of the fact that we're biologically hardwired to do so. But the delta is that when you overvalue something, you're less likely to accept simplistic solutions because you think about it a great deal more than your base instincts, which is happening on their side of the house, and therefore you're more likely to demand things like cohesive solutions. Therefore, on the first extension on where we necessarily improve society, we win this by a landslide. Before I go on to the second extension on the risk-taking behavior of people and the trade-off, yes.
Narratives are symmetric. The difference is no matter how much you review your mistakes or not do risky things, you will not bring back the dead. We explain the solace and hope people get is unique and far likelier on our side.
Okay, here's the trade-off. There's a trade-off in this debate. The trade-off is the ability to get over it on Gov bench versus preventing further loss on Op bench. Here are 2 reasons why we're okay with the trade-off. What they just mentioned, the POI catharsis, is not exclusive. There are a variety of other ways in which you can derive catharsis besides devaluing your losses. The first is you can have conversations with your friends and family who support you and are more likely to support you, because we as a society now see overvaluation of loss as something serious, as opposed to people overreacting. That's why you're more likely to get the help and support that you need. You can go to therapy and self-help to feel better, and I think you feel better catharsis at the end, because instead of suppressing your feelings, you work through them, you get to the root cause, you no longer have that sinking suspicion. This is more meaningful catharsis. The second reason why we're okay with the trade-off is because of the long-term versus the short-term. Loss is more likely on Gulf's world, which means that the catharsis they have is temporary. To overvalue loss, you need undervalue loss, you need to push down self-doubts that might be important. The outcome at the end of the day is simple. Whether or not loss is your fault, if it is, you should reflect more, and even if it's not your fault, you should have more than just flippant responses, right? Like, even if your loss is someone else's fault, you don't go, that was a shit judge, or men are shit. You think about how you can better win those judges, or you think about how you can pick better partners, and that's important. The most important argument in this debate is how we minimize losses in the future, because if everyone agrees that loss is traumatic, losses become more difficult to bear into the long term. Even if you dismiss it, you become bitter and hateful because you blame everyone else apart from yourself. The last reason is that losses become harder to tangibly bear because opportunities get slower as you get older. For all of these reasons, oppose.
We thank the Deputy of Opposition for what is a fine speech and all the opening half debaters for a fine opening half debate. Now to start at the closing half, let's invite on the Member of Government.
He's up all night 'cause he's mad. He's up all night 'cause we're all fans. You're up all night 'cause you're scared. We're up all night to watch Wesley. We're up all night to watch Wesley.
One second. Am I required to use this? Well, speakers before me using this, I don't remember.
It's very
I think it's very minimal.
Oh, the right doesn't work. Great. Okay, that's what I want to hear. Panel ready?
Yeah.
The reality of life is that it is made of W's and L's. The sad truth that everyone has to deal with is that we take more L's than W's on net. What is important, therefore, is the way you anticipate and deal with this life, which is how CG will enter this debate. Because let's face it, opposition's push as to why the status quo is one where we overvalue is fundamentally unfair. Because if you really look at this, none of these narratives are really healthy for individuals on the get-go, which means both probably exist to some level within the status quo. It is what we prefer in order to change these kinds of things. So it's an unfair comparative push that the vast majority of the things that exist in status quo will simply go away, because status quo exists in both. There are a bunch of people who overvalue their losses and a bunch of people that undervalue their losses. Respective of these kind of people, we probably still care about human experiences to some level, because dying is painful and dying in a factory fire is painful. So I'm unclear as to why on OO's side, suddenly when we undervalue losses, all of these mechanisms to protect individuals from like actual real harm just disappears, because we don't protect them because their loss is meaningful, we protect them because we don't want it to happen to us. I think it's a very sick, this very selfish behavior as to why we want to protect individuals, because we realize that the same things can happen to us. It's not a matter of loss, it's a matter of self-preservation, which probably exists on both sides of the house, insofar as neither team explains why loss directly changes your nature for self-preservation. Therefore, how do we enter? The reason why that frame at the start of my speech was so important was simply this. Ian claims, and this is a direct flip of opening opposition, that we react irrationally to base human intuition. That necessarily we are normally intuition in order to react in better ways, in harmful ways, but this overvalue of loss pushes us to order to learn and do other things, etc. This disproves vast of op bench, because if Ian's argument is true, that we do react irrationally to a lot of ways, then it's unclear from opening opposition how individuals are likely to react to this overvalue of loss. Because while you can fiat that individuals overvalue loss, there is no proof as to why individuals value the loss in the ways that opening opposition is likely to claim that they do. They cannot prove that dealing with this overvalued loss will be done well, especially when there are other narratives like the American dream that oftentimes entrench you dealing with that overvalued loss in very harmful ways. So what are the likely ways that these are done horribly on the side of opening opposition and op bench as a whole? Three reasons, three main claims as to where the extension comes in as to how individuals overvalue loss in horrible ways. Number one, it is harder to react except self-reflection because the weight of your loss is so heavy. So the Ian claims necessarily that you're able to assign blame necessarily because you feel that your loss is too light and therefore you assign blame elsewhere. This is not the case. The tipping point to assignment of blame is an aversion to pain. So when you have overvalued levels of loss, you feel that loss so much harder in which that you want to assign pain elsewhere because you don't want to have to deal with that. So this is the tipping point that what causes actions to blame your judges and blame your emotions because the weight of your loss is so heavy that you must want to push it away. We don't blame other individuals because we don't hurt when we accept our losses. The ability to accept our losses means that we can move on better because those losses hurt us a lot less. Human behavior is very simple. We react in aversion of pain and pursuit of pleasure. The ability for losses to be overvalued means that necessarily those losses are painful and therefore we push them outside instead of dealing with them. So I'm unclear as to why individuals on opening opposition deals with these losses well when the base response of individuals is always to push away pain. But secondly, people also now engage in shameful and self-destructive behavior. This is exclusive harm that occurs on opposition because the kinds of behavior, the kinds of losses you're likely to see is portrayed as very shamefully. Because individuals judge you, because individuals perceive you badly, you oftentimes feel very shameful to have these losses or engage in them. Therefore, you never talk about them on opening opposition's bench. You oftentimes bottle them up and fuel them the worst ways. That's why you engage in the worst kinds of self-destructive behaviors, the worst kinds of levels of self-harm because you're bottled up with emotions you never let out because it's so shameful for you to do so. But third, and most importantly, your social interactions become a lot more worse because not just that your loss is overvalued. When your loss is overvalued, it is seen as a detriment towards yourself when you lose. And fundamentally, life comes with winners and losers, which makes you to shift perspective. Every single other person's win now comes at the benefit of yours, which means you always antagonize other individuals because you see their wins as the creation of your loss. You are unable to fully understand other individuals' happiness and you're never able to achieve your own because every form of happiness is compensating for the 50 losses that you get. So the kinds of happiness you get are never valued significantly and the kinds of interactions you get with people are horrible because every other individual's success must come at the expense of your own. That is the mentality that you have towards individuals. So because you're unable to fully understand and inculcate these things, what does this lead to? When you're overvaluing your losses and necessarily have to feel this way and bad interactions, it leads to number one, overwhelming resentment of other people's success, overwhelming resentment of other people's ability to prosper. Secondly, great amounts of jealousy and ability to want to do anything to reclaim that victory, to make sure they lose instead of me. But third, worst kinds of social interactions. You fake friendships in order to get ahead. You fake these kinds of things and you're never able to be genuine with individuals or just have less friends because you cannot stand to see your friends succeeding. What this means is you get less connections and less friends, which ultimately leads to less support structures and safety nets, a fundamental worse and unhappy life for individuals. This directly engaged with opening opposition because they claim individuals get more empathetic. We prove to you the exact flip. Then individuals become a lot less empathetic. You're more likely to backstab individuals because the idea of other individuals succeeding comes directly at your own detriment. I'll weigh this before I take the POI. Why does this weigh? We do not have epistemic access to how the valuation occurs. But the kinds of people that value it incredibly badly on opposition engage in the worst kinds of behavior compared to the worst case on the side of government where individuals engage with undervaluing badly. All this leads to are a couple of things which I'll prove on later. So before I prove on the comparative, Ian.
So your case seems a little bit too debater-centric. My argument was actually that overvaluing losses creates a society which discusses, tries to prevent, and is super careful about potential human, economic, and political losses. That's the case.
Great. Here's the comparative. So this is why we justify the worst case this is why we deal with the worst case on Gov bench. So if these losses actually lead to the behavior that Ian thinks they cause, what are the three ways that Ian claims that is worse on our side of the house? Number one, people engage in riskier behaviors. But this is intuitively untrue. I'm unclear as to why risky behaviors are something, insofar as there are multiplicity, like Raymond suggests, other narratives that prevent you from taking risks. So I'm unsure why the fear of loss is the only reason why you get better factory requirements or get better safety requirements. Oftentimes the alternate narratives that exist, they don't tell me why this was a prerequisite or overwhelming one. Secondly, they claim that people now don't care about further losses. You don't care about further losses because they're inherently painful to you. Therefore, you want to avoid individual pain rather than caring about the losses. That's why you have safety regulations. But secondly, a majority of for the worst possible instances, you're likely to protect the human life of loss that they're claiming. But for a vast majority of instances, losses don't matter as much. Sure, political losses matter and you're able to correct for that with other mechanisms, and human life loss matters because you're able to correct with the other mechanisms. But like the majority of your losses in like debate tournaments or job losses fundamentally don't matter that much to individuals. So we claim that individuals are a lot happier when they come out of it if they value those losses. That's Fine, sure, let's find reasons to value losses less. Finally, people are a lot just happier on the comparative because if you care about things a lot less, life simply becomes a lot simpler. You think about a lot of things far less and you're able to get over these kinds of things. This is fundamentally prerequisite to what opening government says. It's justified because people engage in these things a lot better, people have better social interactions. It's an exclusive CG win.
We thank the member of CUP for that fine speech, inviting on the member of opposition.
UP5! 3, 2, 1. UP5!
Hello.
The first thing I'm going to do at closing is rebuild the world. And I'd note that this is important because Mencias called it out that OO doesn't rebuild what the counterfactual is likely to look like, and Redo in panic tries to rebuild it at responses. We're going to be more disciplined in showing why the manifestation of the overvaluing of losses is likely to make people have a productive behavior of dealing with their losses in order for them to meaningfully move on and not make the same mistakes. One is that in this likely rebuild of the counterfactual, society and your environment is likely to teach you how to deal with losses and how to value these losses in the first place. Why? One, society has an inherent interest for people to be productive. So they don't want you to be self-defeating and just loathe and just rot in your bed all day, specifically because that is bad for how society is likely to turn out. But second, is that these people likely care about you and these people are likely love you, and we're taught the norms, for example, of how to value and deal with losses inherently. But third, is that losing, like what everyone says, is inevitable. You're likely to experience more L's than W's, which is why society would want you to be primed on how to deal with these losses in a meaningful way, that where you can look into these losses, analyze where they came from, and meaningfully move from it. How does this then look like, and how is this likely to manifest? First is that from education and from how you're indoctrinated into society, society is likely to inculcate to you frameworks and methods on how to meaningfully break down the losses that you experience in life. So yes, it is important. Yes, it is likely to change the trajectory of your life. The meaningful difference is that this norm and this rebuilding of the world will tell you why it happened. How are you going to break it down? How are you able to meaningfully move on from it, and what are the root causes? And this is good because society is able to use the history of the losses it experienced, the history of losses from other people, coalesce that into a repository of knowledge that is able to make these frameworks work well. Make these frameworks digestible even to kids. So at a very young age, you are given that sense of adversity, the ability to be able to deal with these losses, even if they're major, even if they're important, in a way that is productive towards you. But the second mechanism and how it likely looks like is social support. Why is social support likely to exist at the same time? One is that people experience losses together. If I lose in a debate competition, I lose with my teammate and I might lose with my institution. That shared experience of loss is already enough for people to come together and talk about their losses and how they could collectively improve on and meaningfully work upon each other, right? What is the manifestation then of this frame? One is that you're driven to introspect and reflect deeply on your losses. At opening opposition, this is how it ends. What I tell you at closing opposition is the way that you introspect and the way that you reflect is one that is likely to be productive because it is supported by the society. You are taught how to do it. You are taught how to meaningfully deal with it, even if it means, for example, that you're likely to be self-defeating, right? Self-defeating. What does this frame then do in this debate, and why is this so important? One is that it's able to neutralize a lot of the self-defeating impacts that comes at OG. They say you might not meaningfully try again because you lose. We say that you can try again on closing opposition. The meaningful difference is you can try it in a way that is better because you analyze your loss, you analyze your mistake, you talk about it with other people, and create and devise a strategy on how you can meaningfully move on, right? But worse is that in OG, you create a world of experienced junkies who live an unexamined life, who just let losses pass pass them by and let life pass them by because it's fine, it's not a big deal. That is harmful because losses can be objectively bad. You might lose your job the next month, like I might, right? But that means that you need to move on. You not move on. You need to learn. You need to sit down with that mistake and you need to know what to do next. Next thing is that what it does is that just removes a lot of the self-preservation argument that comes from CG. Before I proceed to my other extension, opening.
This is derivative. If society wants you to be productive every way, then presumably the debate is when you are no longer seen as productive because you are depressed or have mental illness and cannot rely on narratives that don't fit you.
This is not derivative because this is a rebuilding of what the counterfactual is likely to look like. And I said that there's an inherent interest of the state, of your family members, and of society to want to make you productive and for you to move on with your losses in a way that is productive towards you. On your world, you make them try again, but you don't give them the tools to try again better. They're likely to still be in the same bad situation that they're likely to be in. What is the extension? The value placed on losses allows people to come together and form communities centered around the loss and advocate for change. Note that opening opposition argues institutional reform, things like economies, that's too big. We're going to argue the social cohesion that is necessary for this to activate. Why does this not happen on government? One is that in most instances, when you experience loss, and government has to agree with this, you have an expectation to move on. But I'd note that this is not just an expectation, this is pressure. Even if the loss cripples the shit out of you, like, I don't know, whatever, right? I was about to give a debate anecdote, I don't want to, right? You are pressured to do so. That means that you are forced to move on, even if the loss is painful, even if the loss is harrowing, because they're like, you can just take the L next time and just shoot again, right? But that is harmful because that forces you to suppress how you feel and forces you to not talk about it and just suffer in silence. That is why they cannot form communities on their end, because they're still shamed by their loss, even if, especially if they agree that if it's still likely to be painful. How then do communities form on side closing opposition? First is that the suffering and pain that people experience are now more likely to be visible because people are willing to talk about it. People are willing to sit down and think about how they experience loss and how that has affected them as individuals. Because of this visibility, people are able to, have the empathy to come together and share their experience amongst each other. So it is that contact theory argument that makes you, be empathetic towards people who experience loss and be there for them. But third is that what this does as well, what this does as well, right, is that they are socialized under the overvaluing norm. So the framing that I gave about the frameworks, about the mental things that they're able to do to break down these losses are ones that are used to meaningfully form these communities and deal with the losses together. Why is the formation of this community likely to be good? One is that people just will experience less pain about the losses in general. Because even if it's painful, even if it is important in their life, they have agency because they know what to do. They know how to move on. They know how to try again and have a chance of changing the way that society dealt with them. But second is that even if they're not able to meaningfully make that change, people are able to heal together. You're allowed to be vulnerable with other individuals who are likely to experience this loss and work about it with them. But third is that one, people are able to pinpoint if there's a collective cause of that loss. They're able to, pinpoint the root cause of that loss so that they don't let it happen again, but second, change it if it is unjust. The difference is why this doesn't happen on their world is that they let it slide, that is likely to be worse. This is the best kind of change that you get on closing.
We thank the member for offering that fine speech, inviting on the government web speaker. Here we go.
No matter what, Raven, that is back no matter what, Raven Kimura.
I apologize on behalf of Malaya. Life is full of up and downs, and the unfortunate reality is that oftentimes individuals are dealt with a bad hand more often than they do a good hand. There are two questions I want to focus on in this debate. The first one on self-reflection, which engages with OO, and the second one on community and social support, which engages directly with the entirety of the op bench. Let's talk about firstly on self-reflection. Self-reflection often on their side is done in pretty bad ways for three reasons. The first one is that often people have their egos intact when evaluating losses, exactly because individuals don't have the tendency to want to self-introspect and to want to evaluate themselves on their own
own, and therefore they have to an incentive to want to externalize a lot of that losses, externalize and attribute blames to other parties. Debaters will have the high ego on OO as well, and therefore are more likely to blame it on the judges, the emotions, the teams. They're hyper fixated on goals that aren't there, and therefore they don't have the ability to broaden their perspective because they believe that that was the one reason that they lost, as opposed to the multitude of other different reasons that they could have lost the debate. Secondly, it's scary to confront them. It's scary for individuals to confront themselves and therefore externalize it to other parties. They view them as less deserving of the win, less deserving of the promotion, of the wedding. Therefore, individuals become less empathetic to one another and view them as the cause of your own losses, and therefore it is more likely than not that individuals view this and externalize this in ways that are bad and blame it on individuals. But it is particularly harmful because people blame it on who? They blame it on minorities, on social outcasts, on individuals with no social capital, because the rich and the powerful tap into those frustrations so they to deflect accountability, and therefore the kinds of people they are the brunt of that demonization and the brunt of that subhuman being labeled as a subhuman are often individuals that don't have the same kind of protection as opposed to the majoritarian race. But I would argue that even if you get self-reflection, it is unclear as why some things require self-reflection, because a lot of our losses are a product of luck rather than of hard work, and therefore even if you self-reflect, it's just unclear as to what is the value of that self-reflection, especially the kinds of things that you are dealt with are things that are simply out of your control on their end. So it's just unclear as to what is the value of that self-reflection, especially considering in the vast scheme of the universe, these things are often out of our control. Things like our promotion, things like luck, things like the connections that we have relative to our colleagues, for example, are things that we simply have no control over. Secondly, on risk, they say that people will become more risky on our side. I will put this claim and explain why people become more risky on theirs. Because when losses are dealt with, people feel the need to compensate for that loss and therefore people have more incentive to want to find a higher threshold of compensation. Therefore, you need to recuperate the gains to feel complete and satisfied. So therefore, you become harsher on yourself, and therefore you engage in more risky behaviors in order to be able to recuperate the losses that you have in order to make you feel better. Ian is fine with losing the autos of UADC because he won the goddamn thing the very next year. I was not, because I lost UADC semis because I did the wrong veto. So there's just unclear as to whether or not it's something that can be done in ways that are meaningful. But even if you ruminate in ways that internalize this narrative, that's harmful, because rumination is one that's very personal, and therefore you become less productive in your work. You become more paralyzing in your day-to-day social interactions, and therefore they don't get to claim the benefits of you being more productive, because more likely than not, if you overvalue your losses, that's the point in which you become emotionally paralyzed in order for you to do your day-to-day things. But more importantly, I would argue that on their side, you don't talk about your losses, because those losses are still an indication of shame and guilt and failure, and therefore you reject help and assistance even when they're there, because you have to focus on yourself. You believe that you have control over the situation, and therefore you don't have to rely on your friends. But lastly, therefore the conversations that all says don't really exist. People don't engage in those conversations, because when people overvalue those losses and when those losses are seen as shameful, those conversations will never exist in the first place. Let's talk about social support. I would argue that people become less empathetic and crueler on their side. They are more willing to backstab and resort to violence against others because you are so afraid of those potential losses. The ends become so scary and so paralyzing, you're willing to forsake your community, your identity, the friends that you have in order for you to obtain those wins. Secondly, people are too busy hyper-fixating and ruminating than to care for their friends, and therefore they downplay the achievements of others as undeserving to cope with your own losses and moderate your own emotions rather than it being moderated at the very first instance. But on their side, because you are too busy on hyper-fixating on your losses, what happens is, because of over-evaluation, these losses are seen as being more personal, and because it is more personal, you don't want to talk to it to anyone else, because in order for it to be personal, you need to distance and differentiate from the losses of other individuals. You need to show that your loss is the loss that mattered. Your loss is the reason as to why you can't really get the job that you wanted. So therefore, you always have to paint yourself as the biggest victim in the game relative to other victims that exist in the game already. So on their side, it's just relatively unclear as to whether this exists. Secondly, on the comparative, we find solace in our friends, find joy in the intellectual curiosity of debating, focus on small trivial things and find joy there. Things that have a lower threshold of happiness, and therefore we're able to become happier because those things are far more certain. Because you will try again on both sides, but your motivation changes. Because on their side, their motivation is to win, is to go to the very next stage of the game in order to complete the game. On our side, that motivation is to derive the process and the joy of doing these things. But secondly, I would argue that it's okay to move on. The debate isn't about social pressure, rather it's an individual biological predisposition in order for you to feel good about yourselves. Sure.
Redo actually explains that a society which overvalues losses develops communities, mental health institutions, and conversations and rituals that help you process and reflect on that loss healthily. This both makes the toxicity of CG unlikely and also renders CO derivative.
So it is unclear as to why people will have the incentive to build mental health support structure. Because I would explain that for the vast majority of individuals, if people view these losses as individualized, they don't have the incentive to want to reach out to other people. But even if you build mental health support structures, people have less incentive to opt into those things because they are seen as shameful. So this clearly deals with the entirety of the op bench. Because it's unclear as to whether or not the CO rebuilding of the world is actually one that is true or one that is valid. This swings over OG as well. Because a lot of the OG arguments focus on the individual capacity to be able to overcome those problems. On our side, we explain why the only way for you to be able to overcome a lot of these struggles within your life is through your friends, is through your social circle, is through your families and the people that you hold dear to yourself. Those are the things that often allows you the ability to think rationally, to make sound decisions, because those are the people that will advise you. A lot of the OG's ability focuses on the very empowering narrative of individual capacity to be able to address those issues. But on our side, this is why you have more better social interactions and why therefore people become more empathetic and therefore more willing to reach out for social support from one another, because they value their friends more, because they value the joy of doing those things better, they value the process far better on our side, and therefore they don't view other people as enemies or as threats. They view them as compatriots and friends together in the same struggle. On their side, you fracture individuals and you fracture community. It is very, very clear Malaya win.
We thank the government whip speaker for that fine speech, and now to conclude the semi-finals as a whole, let's invite on the opposition whip speaker.
Three, two, one.
Ready. At CO, we will be bold and challenge the assumption that losses are random and sporadic. We say that often, the largest losses that comes, such as the loss of human lives, comes from controllable things. It is greed, for example, of individuals that was able to create wars or destroy the environment, which results towards the loss of biodiversity. It is populist leaders and authoritarian regimes that continuously entrench individuals, which is the reason why they don't live a dignified life. It is capitalism that makes you, for example, lose your ability to find happiness, your ability to find contentment within the way that you live your life. And what we suggest is that precisely because these institutions that exist in either sides of the debate has an incentive to hide or try to propagandize it as OO suggests, what is unique is the way that you have to take control and understand the causes of these losses. Otherwise, you would be powerless against these types of institutions. Our difference within OO is simple. It is the fact that we were able to show the incentives as to why the over-evaluation will be done well and why the states have the incentive to socialize individuals since they were a child, to understand how to deal with losses, to understand how to break it down, to understand and recommend the types of introspection that you would get. And this is the underpinning of their benefits. If you want to believe that individuals call for accountability, if you want to believe that individuals can learn from it precisely because of the amount of information that they get, the underpinning of this is when you believe the setup at the end that the state that the world where this norm exists, the states and the societies that were created has the incentive to create it well and make sure that individuals are able to interact with the norm well. That shows why individuals can learn. That shows why individuals can grow and develop well, which shafts a lot of the extremeness of CG, because it is unclear why your emotional response is one of depression, one of self-insecurity. If you are socialized as you were when you were 5 years old to deal with the loss of a toy, towards until you were 30 to deal with the loss, for example, of a father, then it is easier for you to cope with these types of losses precisely because of the way that this world was constructed. By that burden, it It is unclear why CG or OG proceeds precisely because they ignore the construction of this world.
Even if societies develop ways to deal with loss on O and CO, one, this concedes our case because we said that our side prevents this pain to begin with, but two, at best, it's just mitigation of my extension which CG copies mech for mech, which proves what societies and groups are kinder to each other to begin with.
No, you don't prevent losses on your side, precisely because the under-evaluation means that you move on quite fast, means that you don't introspect quite fast, and that's why it is repetitive on your side. Wars and conflict repeat in the majority of the instances of the world, precisely because you don't hold them accountable, precisely because you don't take your time to historicize, for example, the reasons why this war happened. That only happens when the world is conceptualized within that type of introspection. The reason why you're able to gain so much information about wars, about the reasons why regimes fall, only happen when you over-evaluate the loss of life, over-evaluate the loss of communities that has happened within tyrannical regimes. That does not happen on your side, precisely because you move on, precisely because you under-evaluate the lives of these individuals. And that's the reason why, even if it's true that you move on, the process of that loss keeps on repeating eternally in their side, which is the reason why individuals will continuously to get hurt. So even at best, that they have states, institutions that try to help you cope with the way that you are dealing with loss, that state institution will always be overwhelmed with the amount of loss that will continuously repeat on their side, precisely because they don't try to take it out of the root. How do you take it out of the root? There are three mechanisms under this that we build from them. The first thing is that because you are able to gain knowledge and historicize the way, for example, that a lot of these bad things happen, communities are able to coalesce within these types of information, which is the reason why it's easier for you to form movements. It is easier for them to participate within critical mass that holds these things accountable. It is easy for us to not disregard individuals and ignore them that otherwise individuals would have done in other parts of the world when the Philippines was terrorized by floods. It is easy for individuals to ignore the peoples who have died, for example, precisely because they undervalue loss. On our side, it is the amount of donation that you get, it is the amount of help that you would get in other individuals who are more privileged, for example, that you are able to get precisely because there is an over-evaluation of loss. On that is unique towards like the mechanism of change, which is the reason why these types of losses don't get repeated. That engages and shows why it is precisely because of the setup and so why we win against OO. Let's talk about closing government and opening government. Their argument that closing government is just that, well, you're going to be too extreme with your emotions. The first thing under this is that this ignores the mechanism of over-evaluation. But even if the fact that it is true, we say that it only happens in instances where over-evaluation fails to accommodate the amount of loss that you have witnessed. So maybe it is the fact that you cry and become depressed precisely because your communities has died from bombing. Maybe it is the fact that you feel helpless precisely because your family has been killed by a fire. In those instances that if over-evaluation and the way that you are socialized with it fails, we say it is justified for you to cry. It is justified for you to suffer. It is justified for you to come and understand those feelings because those feelings comes from big losses. So even if it's true, we say that this happens in the minority of instances, but even if it does happen, it brings such a big catharsis in a way precisely because you feel helpless within that situation. It is good for you to introspect and at least understand, for example, the way, for example, that these things interact with you.
So although this is a normal valuation of these things, you're still able to climb under the wall of the gulf bench, you just cry for less time and you're able to move on to better things within your life and therefore move on from those kinds of traumas.
Yeah, so it's about the extents, right? On their side, when their father dies, it's easy for them to move on in 1 week. On ours, it is good for you to cry for 6 months because your father might be just very important to you. The next thing I'll do is just talk about OG. The problem with OG is that they just assert and push the over-evaluation makes people like scared and difficult, which is the same as CG. We show why the over-evaluation is set up in a way that is not as uncharitable as they suggest. But secondly, your individual ability to break down that loss and understand its root cause allows you the ability to move forward. It equips you with a way, for example, that you change your behavior, change your habits. You exercise more because you're scared of the diabetes that your father, for example, has experienced. Then therefore, it is easy for you to change like your life. But even if they do provide even if they do provide this, the uniqueness is that these losses are repeated and sporadic on their side. They have no control, no information, which is why individuals will continuously be harmed. Lastly, under-evaluation makes you less equipped with the way that you deal with loss. And I think that for the majority of individuals that suffer in the world, that's just quite bad.